Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lynette Ong. I'm a professor of political science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, the meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. It is my great honor today to be hosting this webinar to discuss Dr. Bates Gill's latest book, Daring to Struggle, China's Global Ambitions under Xi Jinping. This is an extremely timely topic. And I'm also very pleased to be joined by Dr. Ketian Zhang from George Mason University. So just a brief introduction about both speakers. Their bios are on the website. Dr. Bates Gill is Executive Director of Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China and Analysis, where he leads a team of research fellows, associated researchers, and administrative staff to deliver on the center's aim to be a global leader for policy-relevant, objective analysis of Chinese politics, economy, and society, and its impact on Asia and the world. And prior to joining the Asia Society, Bates held a number of research and academic leadership positions in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and United States, in a truly global and international career, right? Most recently, he was professor and chair of the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University in Sydney, and was also the inaugural scholar in residence with the Asia Society in Australia. And previously, he has served as director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, as the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as the founding director for Center for Northeast Asian Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Ketian Vivian Zhang is an assistant professor of international security in the School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. She studies rising powers, coercion, economic statecraft, maritime disputes, and grand strategy with a regional focus on China and East Asia. Her book, forthcoming at Cambridge University Press, examines when, why, and how China uses coercion and when faced with issues of national security. Her research has appeared in a number of prominent journals, including International Security, Journal of Strategic Studies, and so forth. And I particularly enjoyed her piece in International Security entitled China, the Cautious Bully. So do check it out, and I really look forward to our discussion. So with that introduction, over to you, Bates.
Okay, let me share my screen, if I may, and share some slides. But Professor Ong, Lynette, thank you so very much for this great opportunity to speak with the Munk School at the University of Toronto. I'm also very honored to be doing so alongside Professor Zhang Ketian, who I admire her work as well, and I'm really looking forward to your thoughts and feedback on this new book. So this book came out last year. It's received some, I think, good praise here and there. I'm still trying to make sure that the book is being properly promoted, and I really appreciate then the opportunity for me to be able to speak with you about it more today. You know, I was thinking about the book a couple of years ago when I began to write it, and I realized that there didn't seem to me, at least, to be a adequate volume that took stock of the first 10 years of China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping, a milestone which we've just passed a couple of months ago, and then tried to understand the implications of that first decade of Xi's power and foreign policy for the future. Because as we know, it appears at least highly probable that Xi Jinping will remain in his position for many more years to come. Some have even suggested he might remain in power for life. So, you know, understanding or trying to come to better grips with China's foreign policy under his leadership is going to be only more and more important in the years ahead. But that's a difficult question. How do you break down such a complex topic in a way that is accessible? I wanted it to be as accessible as possible, not just to China specialists, but to a much, much broader audience of students new to the field, of budding China specialists, to officials, and even to persons in the business community and the interested citizen, to better understand the role of Xi Jinping's leadership and what it means for China's interactions with the international community. And I came up with this Venn diagram as a way of trying to understand this very, very complex topic. And I broke down China's ambitions, or China's motivations, what's driving its foreign policy, into 6 goals, 6 objectives. And this forms the core of the book, the core 6 chapters of the book. And of course, you can't cover everything China does in the international system, but I tried to come up with a framework like this, which captures a lot, if not most, of what they are doing. And in my mind, in relative order of importance to Xi Jinping and the party leadership, I listed 6 of these motivations. And here they are. They're legitimacy, sovereignty, wealth, power, leadership, and ideas. And I put them in the form of a Venn diagram because, of course, they don't operate independently of one another. In fact, they overlap with and gain synergies from each other in the pursuit of China's foreign policy. And of course, I put legitimacy at the very center of this Venn diagram, where all of the other primary motivations for driving Chinese foreign policy would most overlap. So that's kind of the basic construct of the book. And for the remaining time I have, I'd just like to sort of walk through these key goals and try to explain a little bit more about how I link the pursuit of them to the practice of Chinese foreign policy, and talk at the very end of what the implications are of this, and how we outside of China should be prepared to respond. So legitimacy, by this, of course, I mean maintaining and bolstering the legitimacy and even the survival of the Chinese Communist Party. This is a core goal of virtually everything that China does in its foreign policy, and it will remain so. And it has even been, I think, given particular greater strength and urgency under Xi Jinping's leadership. And it's realized through foreign policy with 2 principal targets in mind. One target, obviously, is abroad, trying to convince external societies, capitals, communities of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, the acceptability and even the approbation of the Chinese Communist Party among foreign audiences. The second important audience, though, for this legitimacy narrative abroad, of course, is arguably a more important audience, and that is the domestic audience in China, and particularly the party itself. I write in the book that this legitimacy narrative is put forward through at least 4 foreign policy narratives. One is the ideological one, that only the Chinese Communist Party understands the tides of history. It's a kind of a Marxist-Leninist awareness of history, and that only the party will be able to successfully navigate those tides of histories and emerge in the future, having rejuvenated the Chinese nation. A second narrative that impacts China's external relations is the one of aggrieved nationalism, that only the Chinese Communist Party is in a position to right the wrongs of the past, when China was, degraded and attacked by external forces and and almost brought to ruin, that only the party was capable of pushing back, and only the party can be in a position to prevent that type of disasters ever happening to China again. And obviously this has profound impact on how China deals with certain outside powers, Japan being a great example, but also even with regard to the United States and the West more broadly. A third important narrative is the performance narrative. Only the Chinese Communist Party has been capable of bringing China the prosperity and economic growth that it has enjoyed, and that only the party is in a position to make sure that China continues to advance economically, technologically, et cetera. And finally, cultural. Increasingly under Xi Jinping, there's an effort underway for the party to sort of appropriate and demonstrate its support for some of the cultural touchstones of China, like, for example, its long history, its remarkable achievements of the past, and even continuing into the contemporary era, some of the attractiveness of China globally. The Chinese Communist Party is increasingly trying to appropriate and demonstrate their support for. So legitimacy, or I should say the party's pursuit of legitimacy, both at home and abroad, has enormous implications for Chinese foreign policy, and I think in many respects, mostly negative implications, as we'll talk about in just a minute. Second key objective I talk about in the book is sovereignty. Now, I don't mean in the book strictly territorial sovereignty, like working out the territorial claims in the Himalayas or in the South China Sea, although that's an important element of this driver for foreign policy. But I define sovereignty in the book more broadly, talking about the expanding of China's strategic frontiers and thereby gaining greater room for maneuver in the international system. In the book, I talk about how China's conception of sovereignty has so interestingly changed, from the mid-19th century to today, to a point where, China is probably one of the staunchest defenders today of Westphalian, sort of traditional Westphalian notions of sovereignty. Now, of course, this effort to expand strategic frontiers, and in particular to regain, in China's view, regain or lost territories or assert rightful claims in their mind to certain territories, has enormous implications for China's relations, especially with certain countries with which there are disputes over those claims of sovereignty. And of course, we know that's in the East and South China Seas, in the Himalayas, even, and of course, in reference to Taiwan. But I also mentioned in the book that even internal territories remain contested, where PRC sovereignty claims continue to be questioned and are even potentially a source of conflict. And here, of course, I'm talking about regions like Tibet or Xinjiang, or as we saw in Hong Kong over the past several years. And again, this pursuit of this particular goal in China's foreign policy has sharpened quite a bit under Xi Jinping, with the resultant, I think, largely negative implications for China's relations with many of its neighbors. A third important driver I talk about is wealth, and by that I mean the generation of wealth and national prosperity. Very, very important, obviously, for other elements of China's foreign policy, like the pursuit of legitimacy and the pursuit of power. China, interestingly, has been very, very heavily dependent, more so than many other countries moving up the development ladder, on the outside world. Very heavily dependent on relations with the outside world, for access to the technological, capital, intellectual inputs and markets, of course, all of which have been so foundational to China's economic success. But that's changing now, as we know that the PRC is trying to become less dependent on the outside world, with some mixed success. But clearly, the pursuit of wealth and national prosperity as a fundamental aim for China's foreign policy also has huge implications for how China operates in the international system, and in some cases, negatively so. Fourth, power. And in the book, what I'm talking about mostly here is hard power, leveraging growing economic and military might, and using it in sort of the Joe Nye definition of hard power, using that economic and military might both to induce or try to induce cooperation and alignment with China's interests, or to coerce other countries to align more closely with Chinese interests. And again, under Xi Jinping, this has been a driver which has gained in salience and gained in its use by China in trying to shape the decisions of others to align more closely with PRC interests. So that's the use of economic and military sort of carrots and sticks to try and get other countries to do China's bidding. This is not soft power. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But once again, the pursuit of these, this aim of using hard power in its foreign policy as a way of aligning, getting other countries to line up with Chinese interests, again, has huge implications for how China's seen in the world. And once again, I think the increased use of hard power by China as part of its foreign policy has not improved its international image. And I think we're increasingly seeing some growing pushback on the part of China's neighbors and beyond in response to this increased use of hard power. Fifth, I talk about this important objective of leadership, trying to gain a greater say in how the world works. And this is a relatively new feature for the party's approach to foreign policy, when, of course, China tended to keep a somewhat lower profile. But we see that increasingly, especially under Xi Jinping, there's an effort underway to take greater leadership roles within the international system. And what do I mean by that? Well, expanding contributions to the United Nations system, to try to place more Chinese nationals into higher level positions within the UN system and other international organizations, establishing new institutions, sort of China-led or China-centric international institutions and multilateral bodies, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But there are many, many other examples of China taking that type of leadership role. In the book, I also talk about not just leadership within institutions, but how China is seeking to become a leader across a range of technological sectors. For example, 5G and 6G, so that they can, China would have a better opportunity to set the standards within these emerging technologies. And in some cases, I think China would like to become the leading, even cornering some markets in these increasingly important technologies for the future. So that's China's use of gaining greater leadership in the international system as a way to pursue its interests. And then finally, I talk about in the book about ideas, how ideas are increasingly an important element of China's foreign policy. So promoting ideas and norms that are more aligned with China's party state interests. Now, I talk in the book, of course, that China is not new to trying to promote such ideas in the international system. But what's different now is, especially under Xi Jinping, is that the pursuit of ideas has become a greater priority. And of course, China is itself has more resources and is in a much better position to have its ideas heard and even to have its ideas heeded. I talk in this book about how these particular party organizations, like the Propaganda Department, the United Front Work Department, the International Liaison Department, how these party organizations have become central to this pursuit of having China's ideas accepted and gaining acceptability around the world. Xi Jinping likes to talk about how China needs to tell its story well, and the need for China to gain what he's called international narrative power or international discourse power, 国际话语权, and as a way of shaping how the world approaches certain ideas and norms, and to do so in a way that improves PRC interests. What do I mean by some of these ideas? Well, I talk about 4 in the book. You know, Xi Jinping is constantly reminding us that we have entered into a new era, by which I believe he means an era in which he is going to lead China to become a much more prominent and ultimately a rejuvenated and powerful nation, and that the international system just simply has to get used to that and accept it. He talks a lot about building a community of shared future for mankind, you know, trying to put forward a more benign image for China within the international system. He talks about unity with diversity in the world. And by this, what he means is, I think, that we need to be more accepting of the PRC, you know, one-party Leninist system of government. We need to not only be accepting of it, but take it as legitimate within the international system. In other words, there's not just one right way for a country to be governed, but there are many possibilities, and the Chinese model is one that ought to be accepted as part of a more diverse international system. And then finally, Xi Jinping likes to talk a lot about a Chinese solution or a Chinese model. In other words, that there are aspects of China's success story over the past 30 to 40 years that may well have applications for other countries, particularly those in the developing world. And trying to promote this idea that, you know, maybe Chinese wisdom, Chinese experience, Chinese success can be exported, at least in some circumstances, again, with the idea that that model be more accepted. So those are the 6 main areas I talk about in the book. You know, when I conclude, though, I think that we see that across all 6 of these areas, they've sparked increasing tensions between China and many of its major international partners, many of its closest neighbors in Asia, as in many parts of the world, public opinion towards the PRC and to Xi Jinping himself is in decline. And in many respects, the very pursuit of these 6 goals increasingly run counter to the interests and values of many other countries around the world. You know, wolf warrior diplomacy, assertions of sovereignty, using economic sticks and leverage, expanding military power, trying to promote Chinese leadership and soft power. All of these are facing increasing pushback from many governments and societies around the world, and not just in the global West. But having staked their future to realizing the long wished for goal of national rejuvenation, Xi Jinping and other PRC leaders are going to continue to double down, in my view, in their quest for these goals. You know, it could end well if, it's a big if, the pursuit of these goals was leading to a more constructive and beneficial relationship with the PRC and giving rise to a China that is increasingly prosperous, stable, just, and resolved to peacefully settling its regional and global tensions. But I don't think that's how it's going to end up. In fact, the name of the book, Daring to Struggle, draws directly from language that Xi Jinping is fond to use because he recognizes that these sorts of positive outcomes are unlikely and that a great struggle still lies ahead for China and the international community if China is going to realize its great rejuvenation. So I think it sets us up for a rather contested future with China going forward. What can we do? Obviously, we need to do more to understand both China's strengths and weaknesses. I think we already see countries around the world thinking through how they might be able to gain strength together, to work together in different issue areas to try to counterbalance some of the more unwelcome elements of China's foreign policy pursuits. Societies are learning and talking about how to build greater resilience within their societies to try and resist and push back again against some of these more unwelcome elements of China's increasingly proactive and assertive behaviors in the international system. And I think, we in the West probably need to be a lot smarter and prepare for this competition of ideas. I mean, we've become accustomed to China as an economic competitor. We are increasingly cognizant of China as a military competitor. I think we're only just now beginning to understand that we are going into a competition of ideas with China as well, and we need to prepare ourselves for that. While there's going to be much competition and contestation in our relationship with China, I don't think we should abandon continuing to seek common ground where that's possible. I mean, I'm not naive. I fully understand that that's going to be politically difficult, not only in the global West, but I think even within China. The idea of cooperation with the global West is also politically difficult to pursue. But nevertheless, I think we all understand that with so many enormous challenges in the world today, whether that has to do with climate or pandemics or non-proliferation, global economic and financial stability, none of those challenges can be addressed if we're not doing it in some way in cooperation with China. So I'll close there. Thank you once again, Lynette and Ketian. I'm looking very much forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much, Bates. Over to you, Ketian.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for offering me this wonderful opportunity to engage Bates' fascinating book, which I recommend everyone to actually read in its entirety. And I think the book is a wonderful and comprehensive analysis of the rationale or lack thereof driving China's foreign policy and behavior. And as Bates introduced earlier, each of the core chapters of the book introduced one of the 6 fundamental drivers of Chinese foreign policy. And I repeat here, legitimacy, sovereignty, wealth, that is economic development, power, leadership, and ideas. And in the next couple of minutes, and I'm going to discuss 3 of the 6 elements, which I found really interesting. First being legitimacy, second being wealth, and third being power. And then I'll just conclude very briefly. So I'll try to keep my remarks as short as possible so that we can have more time for Q&A and discussions. So the first factor that strike me as really important in Bates' book is the notion of legitimacy being at the center stage as a driver of Chinese foreign policy. So this might not necessarily be surprising to China watchers in the field, but it might be surprising to sort of non-China observers or specialists, especially those in DC, where a lot of them assume it's really more about national security or expansion that's sort of at the center stage of Chinese foreign policy. But instead, I think it's really important, and Bates does a wonderful job driving home the idea that it's internal security, regime legitimacy, and regime security in particular that drives Chinese as well as Xi Jinping's foreign policy behavior. And I think reading this chapter in particular, I have 2 sort of reactions, which I think is an interesting contradiction to or arriving out of the Chinese Communist Party's emphasis on regime legitimacy or regime security. So the first point is that because China has this internal focus that is regime legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, sometimes we might not be seeing a diversionary war kind of logic operating in Chinese foreign policy. Rather, we're seeing, as Taylor Frivel noted in his earlier book, it might be a diversionary peace, right? So what that means is that in times or at times when China faces internal crisis or internal regime security issues, they might be less prone to use force externally. So that might lead to an interesting diversionary peace kind logic that's that we have observed in regard to China's use of force and its settlement on territorial disputes. But at the same time, and I think the second point I wanted to make here is that it does not mean that we're going to see a China that is just peaceful and not aggressive. And what's interesting, especially in the past couple of years, is that internal issues or domestic politics, especially the need for domestic regime legitimacy and the need to show allegiance to Xi Jinping in particular, drives Chinese foreign policy to be a lot more rhetorically aggressive than it otherwise would have been. So one example that Bates mentioned earlier in his presentation is the wolf warrior diplomacy that we've increasingly seen over the past 3 or 4 years or so, especially during the height of the pandemic, right? We've seen Chinese foreign policy elites or diplomats, although professional, have used rhetoric that is not really professional if we're using diplomacy as a standard. And this wolf warrior diplomacy a behavior might have an internal origin. And as one other book from Oxford University Press, Peter Martin's book elaborated, it has an internal origin because Chinese diplomats wanted to show allegiance or pay allegiance to Xi Jinping, so they have to appear tough and use rhetorics that may not make logical sense to, say, outsiders or observers. So on one hand, diversionary peace, but on the other hand, rhetorical aggression is something that I think it's interesting when we discuss the legitimacy aspect of Chinese foreign policy. And moving on to the second point, which is Bates, one of the chapters in Bates' book that emphasizes wealth or economic development as part of the drivers of Chinese foreign policy. And here, I just wanted to pose a question or something that we can have a little bit more discussion on during the Q&A session, which is economic development is one of the Chinese Communist Party's goals, and of course it serves its legitimacy or regime legitimacy goal as well, and that's partially why we've seen China increasingly being integrated into the global economy since the reform and opening up period after 1980s or so. But the important question here, I guess, is whether increasing integration into the global economy reduce the likelihood of conflict propensity between China and the United States, or does it actually increase the likelihood of conflicts, or does it not have any impact on the likelihood or propensity of conflicts in the future at all? So I have my own opinion based on my previous research. It seems that when it comes to coercion, China tends to use coercion more when it is not dependent on the target state, right? So it might show that economic integration might have a tempering effect on China's coercive behavior. But I think this is a question that I still would like to have a discussion on, since economic interdependence is an important a component to China's foreign policy as it is now, but we've also seen a lot of discussion both in China and the United States in regard to economic decoupling, with Xi emphasizing internal consumption, internal circulation, with, of course, the Biden administration sort of following up on its a path toward economic decoupling. So does that reduce conflicts, or does that increase the likelihood of conflicts in the future? So the third element in Bates' book that I found also interesting is the emphasis on power, in particular hard power, right? Economic leverage and military coercion, especially the negative application of those kinds of power, right? Economic sanctions, military coercion, which I very much agree. And this is something that we've seen increasingly happening in the Xi Jinping era. But I also wanted to add maybe just two minor points in this particular aspect. And the first one being, in addition to economic sanctions and military coercion, China has also utilized gray zone coercion, which is basically the use of civilian law enforcement organizations to inflict physical damage or threaten physical damage on the target state. In particular, we've seen a lot of these in maritime disputes in the South and East China Seas. So it's not technically military coercion because it's not done by the Navy, but it at the same time inflicts physical damage on the target state. And the Chinese Coast Guards are fairly capable in that regard. Sometimes they can match the Filipino Navy, for example. So that's the first one I wanted to add on. And the second one or point that I also wanted to point out is that it's true that we've seen China increasingly using military coercion and economic sanctions, resume coercion in the Xi Jinping era. But at the same time, the usage of these negative means of statecraft did not start from Xi Jinping. And in fact, we've seen China using economic sanctions, gray zone coercion, and military coercion in the Jiang Zemin period in the 1990s and Hu Jintao period in the early to mid 2000s. And talking about, for example, Europe, China has imposed fairly interesting and harsh economic sanctions on France, Germany over their meetings with the Dalai Lama, among, in addition to other kind of issues. So I just wanted to point out that in regard to the application of non-military but still negative means of statecraft, I think Xi Jinping has been using it, but it did not start from Xi Jinping. And if we sort of track the ratio of coercive actions versus the things that make China angry, where China, the things that China views as threatening to its national security, for example, in the South China Sea, it kind of stays stable over the past 30 years or so, which means that China might be quite cautious and selective in terms of when, where, and whom to coerce or to use these negative means of statecraft. So just to briefly conclude, even though Bates stated very explicitly in the book that the book does not seek to uncover a Chinese grand strategy or does not seek to examine China's grand strategy, but I think the book demonstrates very nicely the inherent tension in China's grand strategy. And I think Bates' last portion of the presentation alluded to that as well. So what I mean by that is, on one hand, we've seen a China that wants to defend its sovereignty, national security issues, which means or calls for the use of coercive actions and negative means of statecraft, right? Economic sanctions, military coercion, the things that we've talked about before. But on the other hand, we've also been seeing a China that's increasingly wanting to be respected, to want the matching status that is in proportion to the increase in power that it has accumulated over the past 2 decades or so, as well as wanting to sort of signal benign intentions to the other states, especially those neighbors surrounding China. So what that calls for would be dangling, for example, economic carrots through FDI, or being more present in international institutions. I think Bates mentioned, being part of the UN or being part of the UN peacekeeping missions, as well as establishing new international financial institutions, the AIIB being one of them. These two sets of goals, right? Defending sovereignty, national security versus trying to sort of gain more status, to wanting to be respected, these do not go hand in hand. And in fact, I think they're sort of in 180 degrees in opposite directions. And this might mean that we're seeing a Chinese grand strategy that is, by definition, ineffective in the long term, because these two goals are in tension with one another. And this might also have implications for peace and stability, or the likelihood of conflict in the future. So I'll stop there and look forward to the questions and comments in the discussion.
Thank you so much. Two, really excellent set of presentation. And one thing I really like about the book is really the richness in terms of giving us what is inside China. Quite often these days, when we read about China's foreign policy, it's all about foreign policies. But I think it is important, like what Bates have done, to really stand inside China and to examine its foreign policies and its origins that emanated from the dynamics within the country. And I think Ketian has supplemented with some really interesting perspectives with some of the recent scholarship. So I have a number of questions for the both of you. I'm wary of time. We have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to raise these questions and open the floor for Q&A. So this book was published, I think, in December 2021. So I imagine you did some of the writing during the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic. So looking at it a year, slightly over a year since its publication, how do you think COVID-19 has changed the book's conclusion? Do you think you would have drawn a different conclusion given how Xi Jinping has ended its signature COVID-0 policies? And
Right.
number two, the war in Ukraine. So China calls, Russia and Putin friends with no conditions, right? But whatever term that he has used, but he has also received a lot of pushback against that. How do you think the war in Ukraine has changed the dynamics?
Thanks. Oh,
Um,
do you want me to respond to that now, Lynette?
sure. So just one last point.
Okay.
China's economic decline. So I just taught Chinese politics just before the seminar today. So I say to my students that, we look at demographics, first time in 60 years it has suffered population decline. So the economic decline is, I think, structural, not only cyclical. Given its structural economic decline, it would be quite difficult to reverse that in the short to medium term. And how would that impact on the way that it conducts its foreign policies?
Okay, thanks
So
so
if
much.
you want to take, a
I'll
couple
try
of
to be
minutes
very brief. Yeah, I was able to hit my final chance to hit send and make any revisions on the manuscript was about 2 weeks before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago. And so, yeah, the book unfortunately is unable to really weave that story in of the China-Russia partnership. Although I do talk quite a bit about the China-Russia partnership and predict that it's going to deepen going forward, and so I don't think I was wrong there. Nor was it written, obviously, with the expectation that Xi Jinping would do a 180-degree reversal on his zero COVID policy. In the case of the first thing, Ukraine, I think the findings in the book are very consistent with China's behavior in the wake of the Ukrainian invasion. And it doesn't, and its reaction to the situation between Russia and Ukraine doesn't surprise me one bit. And if people had read the book before that invasion, I think it would have helped. They would have, been informed and expected this kind of behavior from China. The COVID-19 reversal, I think, has surprised everybody. And I'm not so sure that it's a function of China's foreign policy as much as very much a function of a reaction to a domestic challenge to his decisions, which erupted on the streets in widespread disturbances across the country. I mean, I think that was a chastening moment. I guess in terms of the book's overall conclusions, though, do we see a real change then? Because let's face it, 2022 was a bad year for Chinese international image and foreign policy. If anything, a worsening of the trends that I identify in the book. And now will that lead to some more accommodating or more chastened and tempered policy? I don't think so. I think we are seeing a pause of a kind. We're seeing a bit of a charm offensive emerging from Beijing, although I think that's also been thrown asunder by all the balloon incident. This is a pause. And I think, at least in Xi Jinping and other leaders' minds in China today, this is a moment to regroup, to recalibrate, to rethink, and then to emerge, perhaps by the end of this year into next year, again on this trajectory of national rejuvenation, which is going to have all the complications and problems that I talk about in the book. Economic decline, well, certainly China is not going to be returning to the days of economic growth that we saw in the past, but we knew that was coming. Economic decline is another matter, though, because of course China's economy will still grow. I mean, China's economy is going to continue to grow at 2 or 3%, but that's a lot. And so it's going to continue to expand, but just at a slower rate. And of course, the Chinese leadership is fully aware of these demographic and other structural problems. And they're trying, I think they have some plans for how they can address it. I personally think that their plans for addressing it are going to be ineffective. And so, yes, over the longer term, 5, 10, 15 years, I think these economic challenges are going to really continue to mount, especially if ongoing decoupling continues and China's access to Western markets, technologies, capital, and the like continues to dwindle. If that is what happens, that would be very problematic. And you would have to really question whether or not then the party would take some drastic decisions, even diversionary war decisions potentially, as a way of trying to counteract that trend. So I think the next 10 years are critical for the future of the Chinese economy. And we should be preparing ourselves and trying to answer that question that you've raised, Lynette. Have we now seen peak China? Have we? Let's, I think we need to do a lot of study and work on that question.
Yeah, we need to bookmark that question. Ketian?
So I think Bates answered, the first two questions really well. So I just wanted to add real quick to the third question on economic decline. I think the issue, at least it seems to me, is sort of a combination of economic decline coupled with the decoupling policies both in China as well as in the United States, right? So she wants internal consumption or internal circulation, and the national security strategy of the Biden administration last year was fairly clear that it's pursuing, well, it's trying to pursue to the extent possible a economic decoupling kind of a strategy vis-a-vis China. So the issue here, I think, is that if China is completely decoupled or fairly extensively decoupled from the United States and the rest of the world, it might have less of a constraint on its foreign policy behavior, especially, for example, the use of coercion. And in addition, the, I guess, unintended consequence of sort of a successful decoupling is that China will probably have less leverage in the economic realm to use economic sanctions or economic statecraft, which goes back to Bates' earlier point about diversionary war or sort of more drastic measures. It might have to resort to more drastic, for example, military measures, because it might not have the kind of economic capability or capacity or leverage that it currently has. And of course, economic sanctions is still negative, but it might be less negative than, say, outright war or military coercion. So this is, I guess, something that I've been thinking about, but also worrying about in terms of China's future trajectory.
So what you have just said is quite interesting. This is like open up a toolbox. You have economic tool, military tool. When economy is in decline, you have less of an economic tool to use. So there's probably greater propensity and greater likelihood to use hard coercion, right?
Yep. Just think about now it's China. Like
yeah, right. Sure. So the concept of weaponized interdependence that Henry Farrell writes about might be in decline, given that we have less of a interdependence to speak of. Okay, so this gives us a good segue into the Q&A. So I'll go according to the sequence of the questions asked. From Columbus Leo, question about what CCP really believes in. Concentration camps of Uyghur people is brutal. Crackdown to Tibet and more recently to Hong Kong is real, and to Taiwan is concerning. Does the CCP really believe wolf warrior diplomacy is effective, or they really trying to show China can be strong and not afraid to bully others? Yeah.
Well, I think Ketian, I think, summarized very well the sort of convention, not the conventional, but the sort of mainstream narrative among China watchers in trying to interpret wolf warrior diplomacy is the question that was just asked is actually the wrong kind of question to be asking, because it's the right question to ask if you think wolf warrior diplomacy is about the foreigners. It's not. It's about impressing audiences back home, and that then explains the apparent contradiction. Why would diplomats use such rhetoric when diplomats' job is supposed to be building good relationships with the countries in which they are posted right? And that's why we scratch our heads. Why do they think wolf warrior diplomacy is effective? Well, they don't. They don't think it's effective in terms of its foreign policy. It's effective in the form of domestic legitimacy and paying deference and loyalty towards the party and Xi Jinping. So if you look at it that way, then that helps make a little more sense of why wolf warrior diplomacy exists.
Sure. It's very ironic. From Paul Mayer, China is increasing its nuclear forces, but has kept aloof of arms control as practiced by the US and Russia. Do you see this position changing in the near term as part of asserting China's power and leadership?
In the book, I give some time to talking about the military modernization in China, including the modernization of its nuclear forces. This is a remarkable set of changes that China is undergoing. Probably the most dramatic, certainly the most dramatic expansion in its nuclear forces, pretty much since the inception of its nuclear program back in the mid-1960s. China has now surpassed France is now the third largest nuclear power in the world. And if predictions from the US intelligence community, which are not always correct, mind you, but even if they're half correct, China is on a track to really close the gap. And maybe not entirely, but to go a long way in closing the gap in the nuclear arsenals between China and the United States. So this is a big deal. And no, China doesn't want to engage in arms control at this point. It does not want to be limited and constrained. And it is very wary about entering into those sorts of discussions with the United States. So keep your eye on this space, because it has already changed the deterrence dynamic between the United States and China quite dramatically. And in my view, this is because China is determined to deter the United States at the nuclear level, which I think they're very close to succeeding in doing, so that China can prosecute conventional warfare, especially around its immediate periphery, think Taiwan, in ways that they can defeat US intervention in the conventional realm and prevent the Americans from escalating to the nuclear.
Great. Next question from Stephen Trumper. There has been much talk lately about China's demographic crisis, an aging population and declining workforce. Do you think this trend will have a material impact on the dynamics of the 6 imperatives in your Venn diagram?
Ketian, I'm hogging up all the space here. Did you want to respond to one of these?
Sure. That's well, this is first off, this is a great question. And I think and it's an important one to think about. I guess I don't have a clear answer for it. I'll just offer, I guess, 2 sort of potential predictions that are in opposition to one another. The first potential prediction in regard to the aging population is that, and this is research done, I think, by Mark Haas, one of the researchers that focus on sort of ideology and grand strategy. His argument is that it might make China less aggressive in the future because its population is aging. It has to take care of internal issues and internal problems. But on the flip side of the story, then we might again see a China that has a lot more internal issues and problems, which might not necessarily be beneficial for us in a sense of stability, because we might be seeing sort of I don't know, before diplomacy version number 2 or something along those lines. So I don't have a prediction per se, but I think it might go either way.
Okay.
It'll certainly have the largest impact, I would think, upon the pursuit of national wealth and prosperity, because the decline in population, the aging of the population, all of this is going to can have a pretty significant impact on China's overall productivity, and the degree to which national wealth needs to be diverted towards other, perhaps less productive ends as a society ages. So that, I think that's one of the imperatives where it'll be the most troubling. But I think that's precisely why in part it's because of these demographic trends that the Chinese leadership has put forward the importance of innovation, the importance of developing more self-reliant capabilities to introduce technological answers to the productivity challenges that they're going to be facing. And I think we'll see how it goes. You know, we won't know for another 10 or 15 years, I suppose, but this structural change is going to have a huge impact on China's ability to maintain its prosperity and wealth, and the leaders know that.
Sure. So I think our time is almost up. That's all we have the time for. Thank you once again to Bates and Ketian for such an excellent discussion about China's ambitions and its foreign policy and its not so rosy outlook in the near future. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.